Hello, I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor.
Rob, the Dungeon Tutor.
I'm the Dungeon Tutor.
And I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Today we are going to have a quick lesson drawn up over a very complicated subject. So I'm going to try to be as brief as possible to pack in as much information as I can. Today we are discussing, for a friend, how to play advanced Dungeons and Dragons, what many people call first edition Dungeons and Dragons, a misnomer because there was an edition before that, just Dungeons and Dragons, which was almost more of a war game, and it's been evolving ever since. So Advanced Dungeons and Dragons is a compilation of the various rules and experiences that they drafted for years of playing Dungeons and Dragons, packed it into a book like this with lots of options and choices for players. And because it's advanced, it's a little bit arcane, a little bit challenging, so I'm hoping this video helps out tremendously. The important thing, though, is to understand by the time you're done with this, what is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and how is it different from other games? So we're going to begin. First of all, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is a simulationist role-playing game, meaning that the rules exist to simulate a reality in the game. The ideas of, if I do this, how do I resolve it so I can find out the result, is very much what the rules are there for, primarily for combat. This being an early iteration of Dungeons & Dragons, not everything was bottled up, labeled, and neatly outlined on how to do it. So the person running the game has a lot to do, frequently, with adjudicating how do we get to a successful resolution of everything, which can be refreshing. Some people really like that. So in this game, you take on the role of a character, and your character has a class which defines the job that they have within the party. They're key to surviving against the various challenges that they'll face. And yes, because of the nature of Dungeons & Dragons, this is going to dictate mostly how your character can fight and survive in combats. Most everything else about your character is the things that you yourself provide. As far as roleplay, the personality, conscience of your character, in some cases, what your character will know and not know is provided more by the player than by a bunch of numbers that you just roll from time to time. The player has a lot to do with how their character's outlook, actions actually play out. So, the first thing that you'll notice when you have a character, and we're not going to go over character creation, by the way, that's a totally separate thing, and yeah. The first thing that you need to understand is your character. These are the bounds that the character, your avatar, your projection into this world is able to influence the world around them. So, that's mostly defined by your 6 attributes: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Strength, pretty self-explanatory. A character with a higher strength rating is going to be stronger than anyone else. They will hit harder in combat, be able to bend objects and move things, and generally influence the world around them through brawn. People with low strength, not as much. Your dexterity is going to determine in large measure how nimbly you avoid attacks, how quickly you respond to the events around you, as in your initiative, and how well you can avoid major dangers. Also, it helps you to more accurately hit with ranged attacks if you have a high number in this. Low numbers likewise can penalize you if they're very low. Constitution is your personal health. It's one of the more impactful things on your character sheet because it dictates how much punishment you can take before your character dies. And in strict Dungeons & Dragons, that's going to be when you hit 0 hit points. Of course, some groups house rule away from that, but technically 0 hit points means death. So having more hit points between you and death is a good thing. Having a high constitution gives you a bonus, and every single class can use more hit points. Suitably low constitution may actually cost you points. Your intelligence is a combination of how much you know, your learning, your education, how quickly you've absorbed knowledge, and that's not always from just reading books or going to school. Sometimes it's being world-wise and, picking up on rumors and legends and lore. On the other hand, the flip side of that is wisdom. which is your common sense. So, for instance, if your face is wet, your intelligence will tell you that it's raining. Your wisdom would tell you it's probably a good idea to get some cover so you don't, start running the risk of exposure or catching a cold. The two are linked together, and they can be a little bit difficult. I usually think of intelligence as the more active role of your mind when you focus your direction and attention. For example, trying to locate something and trying to see something. Oftentimes your perception directly is a matter of your intelligence when you're investigating and looking for something. Whereas to see if you just kind of catch a detail, that's often based on your wisdom, which is almost always applied in all directions, trying to filter through what you know with what can save you or help you out in a given situation. So characters with a high intelligence often express themselves as I think, whereas a wisdom character might say I feel, and that's the difference between the two. Again, kind of tricky. Not even all game masters really separate those two, for what they mean. But in general, those provide the difference also between the two major casting types in Dungeons and Dragons. Your intelligence is going to be more oriented towards your arcane casters, your magic users, who break the laws of reality with their magics. Wisdom-based casters are going to be your divine casters, like your clerics and druids, and they call upon their faith and greater powers than themselves to do things for them, to change the world as they need it done. And again, often that power comes from without, and one's faith channeling it. So the last one is charisma, and that is both a combination of how likable you can be, when you choose to use your charisma that way. Also, how much you can cause people, mental anguish and distress by wielding that charisma against them. It's force of will, really. But it's most often used to get people to like you. And it has an impact on reaction rolls when you meet other creatures. Many game masters use a reaction roll to see how a creature is going to react to you. Default hostile, or maybe indifferent to you, or maybe friendly. Who knows? A high charisma character can be very useful in a party just by making sure that they have their best foot forward when it comes to meeting other people and possibly not triggering every combat that could possibly be in the offing. So it can be handy. Those attributes generally serve to define your character. And the differences, the heights of one and the depths of another may serve to drive how you visualize the character and the personality you choose to play them with. For instance, a high strength, low wisdom character may very well be a buffoon who counts on his strength to get him through everything and not really think very hard about what they're doing. They'll just trust that their strength will get them through it and plow through whatever makes sense at the time without taking a second and really contemplating how the significant consequences of what they do. A high intelligence, low charisma character might really be smart, but blurt out things inappropriately or feel very bad in social situations. Your archetypal nerd character. So, that can be your first entry point into meeting and understanding your character. Now, there are other things in character creation too. There's your character's race, which may alter your statistics to some extent. They may also change your outlook and give you new special abilities. In standard D&D rules, they also can put a cap on how high you can progress in terms of your levels and of experience. And you may actually have to qualify for some races. If you have statistics that are too low, you might not be able to be certain races, again, with following the rules strictly. And again, your group may or may not use those rules. And that's one thing that you're really going to find in Dungeons & Dragons, especially Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The rules change from group to group because not everybody puts the same value on certain sections of the rules as others. And that's fine. That's been the default for as long as D&D has been around, 1974. So when thinking about these things about your character, it's good to know how the world is going to react to your character and which rules you're going to be using. So make sure you get in contact with your dungeon master about those things. Now, speaking of dungeon master, you as a player are responsible for your character. You run the character, you make decisions for that character. They are your avatar in the game. The dungeon master runs the game. and they have a pretty hefty job. They keep track of just about everything from the monsters and how they behave and act, combat numbers, making the world live and breathe around you with their narration. They wear a lot of hats, much as I do. And again, the hat of the narrator, whenever the game master, dungeon master, what have you, is narrating, you should be paying strict attention. These are the eyes and ears of your character, after all. And yeah, some of us go through life without paying much attention to what's going on around, but in Dungeons & Dragons, that can kill you. So I highly recommend when the game master is using their narration voice, you pay attention. Also, the way that Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is designed to be run, almost everything flows through the game master. In combat, you roll a 20-sided die, add any bonuses that you should apply, like for a magical weapon or some such, and then report the number to the dungeon master, who looks on the matrix appropriate to your character, class, and level, and sees what armor class you hit to determine if you hit. Now, some groups don't do that. Some groups put that in the hands of the players so that you know what your to-hit matrix is, or have a clever little device called a Thsi, we'll describe in a second, so that you can determine what armor class you hit, so you can report the result of your combat to the dungeon master and not have to take that extra step. But in the basic rules, yeah, the game master, the dungeon master runs everything. And when I say game master, it's because there's two active roles in terms of responsibility for a game of Dungeons & Dragons, and sometimes they're done by the same person. Oftentimes they are. The dungeon master is the one who narrates and reveals the world, and controls the non-player characters, directs what people see, directs how people respond to the characters, and what goes on. Sometimes there's a second authority figure called the referee, who basically keeps track of the statistics and numbers. If there's a combat, they may be the one that's fact-checking against what you roll and see what you hit to determine if you succeed or not. That can be very chaotic if you have a large group, so sometimes a referee is useful for that. But oftentimes the dungeon master takes on both mantles. So, as far as having your character, you know your attributes, your basic 6. A few things may be gleaned from your equipment, like your armor class, depended by the armor that you are wearing, and possibly a high dexterity roll. You may also have other things like, well, hit points. And hit points, again, when that drops to 0, you're either out of action or dead, so you would generate hit points right away, and that's determined by your class. It directs you to roll one of the several kinds of dice that Dungeons & Dragons uses, and if you are starting at a higher level, you may have to do this a couple of times. After every level, at least in the early levels, you add your Constitution modifier, if you have one, to your hit points, and try to get as many as you can. It just helps you stay alive, because even a person who thinks they've got all the bases covered can be surprised by the wiles of the Dungeon Master and the dungeon presented before them. So, your gear often is, when you start off a character, oftentimes you're just given a dump sum of money to buy at a store, maybe role played out, maybe you're just given a list and check off what you want. Every game runs a little bit differently, you understand, so I'm just giving you generalities at this point. Your dungeon master should tell you the specifics on how exactly you're going to be orienting these things. Make sure on your character sheet that you write down the important statistics. Not just filling in the numbers, but also next to the numbers there's going to be sections for information that those numbers will give you. And those are all in the player's handbook. Becoming familiar with this, especially the area that describes your class that you're going to be playing, very, very useful. Can't say that enough. So, if you are not playing a spellcaster, your job's going to be relatively easy. Just keep track of the abilities that you have, and I highly recommend this. Separate the dice rolling from what you think about your character. Try things. Don't necessarily look for a skill to bail you out. Just tell the game master, the dungeon master, what you want to do, and they'll figure out how to get to how you succeed. Obviously, if you have a high strength, look to do things that will involve your strength and give you a better chance of success. If you are very nimble, that may be the path that you would take more so than brute force. So, as far as using your character sheet and looking and keeping track of all of your numbers, I strongly recommend keeping everything updated. If you pick something up, write it down on your character sheet. If you spend some money on something, immediately change it on your character sheet so you can keep track of all that stuff. Oftentimes in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of game masters revel in the minutia. So accurately keeping track of your wealth can be very, very important. Keeping track of your gear and supplies will be important for reasons that I'm about to go into. So, if you have your character sheet all filled out, all the information in front of you, and you also have, your name picked out, an idea of what you have going forward, there's a couple of things that you do have choices in besides picking out gear, picking your class, picking your race. One of them is your alignment, and that is, well, a thumbnail sketch of the outlook of your character. There's two axes to that, law and chaos, and good and evil. And if you drew those out, there'd be a nice 3x3 box with neutrality in the middle on both axes. And basically what those mean, just to demystify this, law means you believe in giving your word and you believe that a structured society is the best society. So following laws is inherently helpful. Helps everybody. You should expect everybody to follow the laws of the land. Chaos puts little stock on law in general, and generally also things like honor. Honoring your word may be a foreign concept to you as a chaotic. Now, these are not absolutes. Do lawful people occasionally bend the rules? Yes. It may be difficult for some based on oaths or something, but rarely is alignment absolute. Likewise, chaotic. Chaotic people can keep their words, no problem. They can follow laws that they feel are just and appropriate, or it benefits them to do so. They don't have to break every law that comes in front of them, you see. Now, good and evil are a little bit harder to bend because good basically values life. You're generally working towards the welfare of yourself and others. So that's generally good, and most people have a good understanding of that. Evil, on the other hand, means that life has little value and you are the single most important person. So a person who is truly evil may not go around just slaughtering people because, but certainly they're not going to put themselves at great risk or peril for no good reason. They're going to be definitely motivated for self-interest or for the interest of a cause that they really believe in that has nothing to do with the advancement of human life and welfare, or any race's life and welfare, to be honest. So the alignment can be a little bit tricky, but between those two axes, you can define a general outlook of your character. Again, most characters, it's not crushingly important, although some game masters really do kind of urge characters to strongly follow their alignment, even to the point sometimes of punishing them. So again, it's a good idea to know your game master. Another thing that's kind of often left out, but really can be useful in some games, are languages that you might know. That's a function of your intelligence and also sometimes of your race. And knowing a particular language can be useful if you want to negotiate with certain monsters and creatures and people. And the more languages your group has access to, if you should stumble across, I don't know, wall graffiti or maybe a rare tome, having somebody who can understand it might be really useful and give you a shortcut or give you some sort of an advantage. And an advantage against life isn't a bad thing. So, once that sheet is all filled out and you know what generally your character's personality, you've kind of come up with some thoughts. I'm just really briefly going to touch on the different races. We'll cover that more in character creation, but from the perspective of how it may change your personality, remember, dwarves are really long-lived. They rarely are rash because they have a lot of life to live. And if you, say, lose an arm because you did something without considering it, you have to live with that for possibly hundreds of years. So dwarves generally take safe, measured approaches. That's not to say they all do, but that's generally the goal of dwarves, is to master your craft and think of the long game. Elves more so. Elves think of the long game because they live hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So oftentimes elves are rarely rash. Now, if you want to play somebody who's aberrant and you play a rash elf, that could be an expression in your world. Rare as a rash elf. But elves, generally tend to view the quality of their lives as being important. They love the beautiful things in life and favor culture, because you can build up a lot of culture in hundreds of years. And they also rarely do things, they'll throw themselves at a threat that they absolutely need to, or to save somebody else possibly if that's their job, but most elves think long term too, and that might affect your personality. Gnomes love the things that gnomes love: cleverness, craftiness. Many of them love nature and revere it, and they also kind of love, yep, a little bit of chaos here and there, sometimes by causing some mischief or doing things that are rather quirky. Gnomes can be a lot of fun to develop a personality around. Halflings, well, you know what a hobbit is, right? That's where they got the idea from. So they generally do not love adventuring, but you do have some who have an adventuring streak to them, and will risk themselves and be just as brave as everyone else going out and risking themselves. But because they're small, they're often underestimated, which can be pretty useful. They're also quite nimble, so they make some of the finest thieves in the game. So, good on you. So, once you have your character in mind and you have the numbers that you need, you're pretty much ready to play. Now, a couple of things about how to play. First of all, combat. If you're going to strike somebody in combat, it's fairly easy to resolve. You roll a 20-sided die, you add any modifiers, and then you either report that to the Dungeon Master or referee, or you compare it on your own matrix that you have to attack with. Or you would take your roll, say you rolled a 17, you might have a statistic called THAC0, which is abbreviation 2-hit armor class of 0. Armor class in Dungeons & Dragons works a little bit differently from more modern games. It starts at 10 and descends as it gets better. It has its roots in wargaming, and that's a leftover part of it that goes away after 2nd edition. But what THAC0 does is it allows you to take that result you rolled, like say I have a THAC0 of 14, and I roll the dice, add up my modifiers, and I get a 17. I know that there's a difference of 3 from 14 to 17, and that would mean that I actually got better than a 0, so that would be a -3 that I hit with that. And after you've used it a bit, it's not very difficult. It is actually simpler sometimes than having to pull out a matrix whenever you attack. So if that works out for you, great. If you prefer to use a matrix because it's quicker for some people and they don't like to do math, that's fine too. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons can work either way. And yes, THAC0 did come out of AD&D. It's more well known for 2nd edition, but it does make an appearance in the Dungeon Master's Guide as THAC0, so we can go with that too. Everything else from combat is usually going to be spells, which have their own rules. And after that, it's just knowing mechanics, like how does your group do initiative? There is a way to do it out of the book, which is, one side goes at a time, and then there's an ordered structure between missile fire, hand-to-hand combat, and finally spells. That can be interesting. Your first engagement with initiative may be very different from group to group. Some people favor the more modern versions where you just roll a die, add your bonus, and then you just fall into a list. Everybody gets a turn, and the players' turns may intersperse with the monsters. Your group may vary. I think initiative is one of those things that's changed more than any other mechanic that I know of, as far as something that you use every time combat comes around. So, yes. Surprise is something that's usually checked for at the beginning too, which may leave one side unable to act if they are surprised. Some of the advantages of certain classes and races are that they are harder to surprise, so bear that in mind when your group is suddenly confronted with an enemy or a threat. It can be very important. If you have not yet come across saving throws, saving throws are basically your character's way of getting out of special dangers. Not just the attack of a sword, spear, or an arrow, that's your armor class. No, this is something that you actually have to try to avoid some kind of gross threat or challenge to your character. Is it having your mind taken over by a spell? Is it a dragon's breath breathing flame down upon you? Is it resisting a poison that you just had injected into you or drank? Well, all you do for that is you roll a 20-sided die and you compare it to the number that you have appropriate to your class and level. And as you go up levels, that descends. You have to roll equal to or higher than your saving throw most of the time to successfully defend against that attack. Sometimes in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, because characters are relatively cheap and easy to make, some of the results of that might be death. And that can be a real eye-opener if you've played other games before, but failing a saving throw against poison, for instance, against many monsters, can instantly result in your character dying. There may be ways of bringing them back, yes, but your character can have mortal dangers all around them. Oftentimes, though, making a saving throw may allow you to take a lessened version of an attack. For example, if you make a saving throw against Dragon's Breath, you often take half of the damage that that attack would inflict, rather than the full, and that can save your life sometimes, so bringing out your lucky dice for those rolls can be really, really useful. So now that you know saving throws, oh, and by the way, saving throws are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but many Dungeon Masters allow the players to keep track of that themselves. Bear in mind, players, some attacks are so potent, they may actually give you a penalty on your die rolls, so a roll that just made it might actually miss, and some are actually feeble and might actually give you a bonus to your roll, so don't always take what you roll as gospel that you've succeeded or failed. That may actually change. Another thing that's important in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, outside of keeping track of your character and your particulars, is the world around you. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was built on 3 primary pillars of experience. The first one is combat. You're going to have encounters that can only be resolved by combat most of the time. In almost every game, every dungeon, there's going to be a time where you just have to whip out spells and swords and go at it. And that's what a lot of the mechanics of the game are about. So good on you, your character should have some means of defending themselves. But that's not everything. And some people lose track of that all they concentrate on is how effective their character is in combat. Another pillar of the game is exploration. And that is an art for some people, including the skill of mapping. Yes, there are some tables that don't actually show you a map of the area. The Dungeon Master relates the particulars of the room, hallway, whatever, and somebody's job is to actually map it out so the party doesn't get lost, or maybe the map might reveal an area that was hitherto unknown, that might show that there's a secret door in play in that area. It can be really, really useful. Modern sentiments are to show some sort of a map so your players have frames of reference, but that isn't how it always was. So, bear in mind, your group may have some mapper required for the group by the Dungeon Master. There are provisions in the books for that. Another challenge that you have to deal with in exploration is the tone of the Dungeons & Dragons world. If you're in a dungeon, you are frequently going to have the Dungeon Master rolling based on the time that you spend in the dungeon for something called a Wandering Monster encounter. Wandering Monsters are generally something players don't like, because it enforces a combat or some sort of a challenge, which may not always be bad. There are sometimes good encounters on the Wandering Monster table, a friendly party, for instance, or an NPC that can be useful, or even a friendly monster. But generally, Wandering Monsters don't carry their treasure with them. And treasure is important, because treasure is one of the ways that you get experience as you go. Magical items have a treasure value. Gold that you bring home, that you bank, get out of the dungeon, gives you experience. That is a hallmark and measurement of how successful you've been. Therefore, the actual experience you get for defeating monsters may be relatively minimal compared to the take that you make. So most players will run their characters as wanting to get as much as possible out of each encounter. Wandering Monsters represent a drain on your resources. It's something that can only get you monster experience and little. Most monsters might carry a little coin, but that'd be about it. It's the lairs that you want to go and sack, because that's where they keep their loot, you see. So, Wandering Monsters are certainly one threat that a group that's been in a dungeon for a long time has to contend with. The other one is the diminishment of resources. You only have so much food. You only have so many torches, perhaps. You only have so much water. That's a big one. And as you go along, those resources can get expended. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons does really preach on keeping accurate track of time for the Dungeon Master, because those finite resources the party has can really take a toll on a group and provide an extra amount of tension and challenge. So keeping accurate track of that is essential for some groups. For others, not as much, especially when you get a few levels under your belt. You may give your party things that make some of those resources pretty questionable. Merlin's spoon, for instance, is a spoon that when you stick it in a bowl, it makes porridge. Now you'll never starve. It's not great food. You love to have anything else, but it'll keep you alive, so you'll never really starve. Anything with continual light means that you don't have to worry about torches anymore, unless it gets dispelled, but you're always going to have light, and maybe you'll keep some backups, but this will free you from one of the obstacles of long-term dungeoning and exploring. So resources become very important in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and players should have some consideration about covering their bases as far as what they can see, what they can drink and eat that keeps them going, and occasionally other quality of life things. For example, the venerable 10-foot pole. A 10-foot long stick of wood is cumbersome. It's not convenient to carry with you at all, and it's not a weapon, so some people have a hard time justifying having it. But on the other hand, if you have to poke or prod something far enough away that it's not likely to hurt you, a 10-foot pole is ideal. A 10-foot pole can scrape and tap on the floor to listen for hollow spots to try to, reveal pit traps. And there's a million uses for a 10-foot pole. But those are one of those quality of life things that a smart party member might consider having when they go dungeoning. So exploration and combat are two pillars. The last one that's primarily a focus is the cerebral, because oftentimes there will be riddles and puzzles to solve in order to progress. And that really is something that players either love or hate. Let's face it. Some players don't like to do too much thinking when they're dungeoning. But people like me who absolutely love a good riddle that I can sink my teeth into, and when you solve it, it's a victory for the player. It's affirming to have puzzles and riddles in your games from time to time, because it lets the players be smart. And that's pretty cool. D&D has been envisioned by a lot of people as a cerebral game anyhow, and this does help. So those are three areas that are kind of somewhat baked into the game. On top of that, though, and traps in their own way are kind of a cerebral challenge, mostly because you have a class that's oriented around it, and if you don't have a thief or the thief hasn't succeeded, oftentimes you can thwart a trap by cleverness. And game masters often appreciate that and allow players to defeat the traps without having to roll percentile. Figure out how your thief is going to do it. So that's useful. One thing that you may not have heard about in those three experiences is role-playing. Because in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, role-playing is about knowing your job and doing it well to help the group succeed. Actual role-playing, as in having a personality and talking in character, has almost always in games, especially the earliest ones, been a factor of the Dungeon Master and their style. If the Dungeon Master talks in character for his NPCs and invites the player characters to talk as their NPCs, that's a different level of experience than the Dungeon Master just reporting what is said and the players reporting what their characters do. It keeps a layer of separation between the two so that your player and your player's character have that degree that you are my playing piece, I am running you. As opposed to eventually, your characters can start taking on some of your own personality, and that's a level of immersion that players oftentimes will gravitate to. You start telling when you start saying, instead of Clorg walks across the floor and flips the switch, you might catch yourself saying, I walk across the floor and flip the switch. It's just you're identifying with your character, which is cool. Another thing that's pretty important in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons to remember is that it's you who are succeeding more often than not. It's you who make decisions, not necessarily a bunch of rules or numbers. It's you who tries the crazy thing that might blow up in your face tremendously. but it's also you who might be able to do that clutch thing that maybe there's no one spell that describes it, or maybe you think of a clever way of using a resource that you have that gets you by. It's a lot of making stuff up as you go, and not as much following the numbers and the chances and percentiles of whatever that you have of success. It's about trying cool stuff and making it work. Or it's about an interplay between yourself and the dungeon master in making the moment seem cool. And a good dungeon master will work with you on trying to sometimes do crazy stuff that just might work, just might give you a bit of an edge on life, or at least this alternate life that we play in the game. Now, yes, sometimes the dungeon master will not see eye to eye with you and say that doesn't have a chance of working. Fine. But oftentimes, I highly recommend players play their characters and worry less about playing the numbers. In Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, with so much left to interpretation by the Dungeon Master, this can become an important part of your Dungeons & Dragons experience. Try things, let the Dungeon Master figure out how it all works. One thing I will tell you, though, quite often, is that most Dungeon Masters have a mechanism by which you roll a die, usually a 20-sided die, against a statistic that you have, and they have some way of figuring out if you succeed or fail by it. Maybe it's rolling underneath your statistic, so rewarding somebody with a high statistic by giving you a greater chance of success. It's pretty popular in my groups. I've used that myself for many years, and it works quite well until you start getting characters that have 17s, 18s, and 19s and things and have almost no chance of failure. Then some things can really become automatic until you start assessing penalties to rolls like that. But in general, there's almost always a way, through some cleverness of the Dungeon Master, or perhaps a suggestion that you have on how you want to do something, that can get you through almost anything you can imagine. It is a fantasy world with almost infinite possibilities. And how much you get immersed in it, how much you take out of it, ultimately falls in the interplay between yourself, the players around you, and the Dungeon Master. This is a game. Never lose sight of that. This is not something that should be taken seriously. If a call goes against you, okay, now you know how that ruling goes, you can proceed beyond that. If your character dies, tragic, sure, you can really fall in love with these characters. There's no denying it. But there may be a resurrection possible based on how much success you've had in the past. Powerful characters may be able to have a friend who can help them out. And if not, roll up another character and take another crack at it. Maybe try a different side. Different classes can give you a totally different outlook on how to play, or maybe a different outlook for your character as far as alignment, as far as beliefs go, may significantly change how you experience the game. And I recommend taking several cracks at it. Don't let one success sour your experience by expecting that all the time. Don't let a failure sour your experience by convincing you the world is against you. Either experiences may be good. Failing forward, finding something good out of a failure, even if it's just getting everybody to laugh, that can be really cool. And some game masters really do like that idea of you fail, but yet something still happens out of it that kind of progresses the story or keeps things going. So, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is a venerable game, and your experiences may vary from table to table. It may also vary by books that you use. There are some books, like Unearthed Arcana, that can add new rules, new character options, and things like that. If those are available in your game, maybe take a look at them. You can get by just fine on what's in the player's handbook, but sometimes those other books can give you a different experience and something you'd enjoy. I would generally recommend that first-time players just stick to what's in here. It's relatively simple and can give you a bit of a relief from having to juggle books when you're playing. Your game may actually take place in other lands, in which case there might be a source book available for that, like Greyhawk Adventures, Dragonlance Adventures, or the Oriental Handbook, and that might give you another dimension to your game as well. Either way, though, if you are new to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and you are looking right ahead at playing your first games, I envy you. I really do. You're about to take your next step into a much larger world. Even if you've played other role-playing games before, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is unique. It has its own flavor, it has its own tone, and of course, filtered through the lens of the Dungeon Master you're going to be playing under, it may be a wacky and far-out gonzo experience, or it might be something that provides a diligent structure and different challenges than you've ever faced before. Either way, though, I hope you have fun with it. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope that you bring your own love of the game to it and makes the experience better for the Dungeon Master and any referees there may be, your fellow players, and cultivate something deep in yourself that you can pass on to others. So, I am Rob the Dungeon Tutor. This has been a thumbnail of how to play Dungeons and Dragons, the advanced first edition model. I hope that this has helped you, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know at either my Dungeon Tutor Facebook group, or just directly sending a comment here, or commenting on my Thsi Facebook page would work too. And perhaps that might incite another video for you. There's a lot more to talk about in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, from making a character, tips and strategies in surviving old school, and we'll certainly work on that. But I'm hoping this sets you off in the right direction to experience the game at its fullest and have a lot of fun. So until next time, my friends, I'm Rob the Dungeon Tutor, and I will see you next time. Farewell.